Welcome, my fellow masochistic McCarthy readers. We meet, yet again, in a solidarity rife with general confusion and hopeful discovery. Were you scratching your head after reading this one? Because I know I was. So pour yourself a stiff one, because we got some grim stuff to talk about. Soothe. Hello, and welcome back to It's Too Late to Apologize book reviews. I'm Stella, and today we're going to be talking about Cormac McCarthy's Outer Dark. Outer Dark was Cormac McCarthy's second novel, published in 1968, and boy, is it a bleak one. I must have read this book almost 3 times while writing this review. The sticky notes multiplied like rabbits. This thing doesn't even close properly anymore. Now, if you're wondering to yourself, Stella, you're looking extra lumberjack today. Why, thank you. I happen to like a bit of buffalo check. Multiple layers of said pattern I refer to as buffalo bonanza. So do with that what you will. This story is split between 3 perspectives that move back and forth in time. One is of a group of 3 evil men that travel the land with a vengeful, violent nature that can never be satisfied. They are always on the move and are most comfortable in the shadows. There is Culla, a young man who has impregnated his sister, whose willful ignorance of his condemning choices sets him on a path of self-perpetuating catastrophe. He takes his and his sister's newborn baby and abandons it to nature, to die, because of the shame he is unwilling to face or have known. And then there is Wrenthy, the pregnant sister who is betrayed by her brother and wanders the earth in search of the child who was taken from her. Her childlike naivety and obliviousness and similar original sin places her on the same ignorant starting point as Culla, but her fate and choices take her on a much different course. This is the surface-level story that many readers have interpreted as a semi-autobiographical story of McCarthy's life, as he had a son and was going through a divorce at the time he wrote this novel. I like to separate the author from their work, so while some may agree with that stance, I'm going to take a pretty sharp exodus from it. And huzzah! The biblical references commence. As with all McCarthy novels, there is the surface-level story, and then there is the deeper, ontological, and subconscious layers where his brilliance really shines if one's willing to look for the meaning behind all his unusual word choices and seemingly random scenes and actions. I'm going to try to do my best to dive into that, so be forewarned that spoilers are coming, and we're about to get into it. The 2 siblings, Wrenthy and Culla, live in a secluded house away from town. In the first scene we have of Culla, Wrenthy is waking him up from a terrible dream. There was a prophet standing in the square, with arms upheld in exhortation to the beggared multitude gathered there, a delegation of human ruin who attended him with blind eyes, upturned and puckered stumps, and leprous sores. The sun hung on the cusp of eclipse, and the prophet spoke to them. This hour the sun would darken, and all these souls will be cured of their afflictions before it appeared again. And the dreamer himself was caught up among the supplicants, and when they had been blessed, and the sun began to blacken, he did push forward, and hold up his hand, and call out. Me, he cried, can I be cured? The prophet looked down, as if surprised to see him there amidst such pariahs. The sun paused. He said, Yes, I think perhaps you will be cured. Then the sun buckled, and dark fell like a shout. The last wire-thin rim was crept away. They waited. Nothing moved. They waited a long time, and it grew chill. Above them hung the stars of another season. There began a restlessness and a muttering. The sun did not return. It grew cold and more black and silent, and some began to cry out, and some despaired, but the sun did not return. Now the dreamer grew fearful. Voices were being raised against him. He was caught up in the crowd, and the stink of their rags filled his nostrils. They grew seething and more mutinous, and he tried to hide among them, but they knew him, even in that pit of hopeless dark, and fell upon him with howls of outrage. That was very true. So in this dream, it's as if Culla is waiting for the sun god to cure him, also known as the Christian god. when he is better off than those begging for help. Wrenthy is pregnant with her brother's child, and Culla's shame over her pregnancy is seen in how he goes out of his way to make the traveling tinker turn away from his home without coming anywhere near it. The baby is born, to Culla's disappointment, and the second Wrenthy falls asleep, Culla takes the baby into the wilderness to leave him there to die. But in some twist of fate or conscience, he loses his way and finds himself back at the baby, perhaps for a chance to redeem his unforgivable choice. And this is the child. It howled execration upon the dim carmine world of its nativity, wail on wail, while he lay there, gibbering with palsied jaw hasps, his hands putting back the night like some witless paraclete, beleaguered with all limbo's clamor. A paraclete is a helper, or commonly refers to the Holy Spirit. The child seems to push away the dark, to bring the morning, the sun that would have saved Culla if only he accepted his own responsibility. But no. Instead, Culla does nothing, and witnesses the tinker find and take his child. The tinker takes Culla's salvation. And on a side note, I think the child becomes the tinker's salvation instead. He gave his life meaning, and I think that is why the tinker gets so mad when he finds out that his salvation was born of incest. That's my theory anyways. But back to Culla. He feels as if his creator, God, will not save him, but the child's creator will not save him either. It seems God and man are guilty of the same things here. Oh, the irony. Culla tells Wrenthy the child died and that he buried it. Wrenthy slowly recovers from giving birth and transforms. One evening when he came in, she was sitting in the chair, demurely and half smiling, her figure thin and wasted under the ragged shift she wore as if great age had come upon her, and her eyes huge and fever black. He entered slowly and shut the door. "Well," he said, "you feelin' that pert?" "I'm better from what I was. You fell off considerable, ain't you?" "Lord," she said, "I've gained back from what I was. I was puny as I wasn't nothing but a shadow." She seems to have aged or matured, and Culla thinks that she has worsened, but she says she's improved from where she was. She says she used to be a shadow. And this really made me think of all the mentions of Culla's shadow through the story. Once it is said to be a dark stain he stood in, that his long shadow overrode Wrenthy, and his shadow assaulted that of the squires. The shadows are perhaps the visible embodiment of sin, and the darkness those three men are so comfortable with. Wrenthy eventually discovers Culla's lie. She had not dug but a few inches before she came upon packed clay, unsevered roots. She chose another spot, and soon uncovered a bedded rock, which bared the oblique lightfall of the sun's retrograde, lay scored with powdery axe marks. His long shadow overrode her, but she still did not see it. She stood and turned, and found herself against his chest. She screamed and fell back, stumbled to the ground, crushing the flowers, the blood starting again, warm on her leg. But he was the one, kneeling in the dark earth, with his writhen face, howling at her, saying, "Now you done it. Now you really went and done it." And her own face, still bland and impervious, with such wonder he mistook it for accusation, silent, inarguable female invective, until he rose and fled, bearing his clenched hands above him, threatful, supplicant, to the mute and windy heavens. And here we see Culla unable to take any responsibility for his actions. He blames her for discovering his lies, and then he runs away, unwilling to face it. His hands are described as asking the heavens for some reprieve, but heaven is silent. How shocking that heaven doesn't have his back. Now, from here, the timelines get a little convoluted. Culla leaves to sell the shotgun, but he also takes all the money in the house with him to get supplies. While he's gone, Wrenthy sets out to find her son and hides from Culla when he's on his way back to the house. So this is from Wrenthy's perspective. "I wished he'd come on," she said. When he did come, he looked like a man who has a long way to go. He had the supplies in a sack over his shoulder, and he went by slowly, with his eyes to the ground. She crouched low while he passed, and when he was gone, she roused and dusted off her dress and took up her bundle and returned to the road again, walking out his tracks to the crossroads and to the store. Now, do you see how Culla's name is not mentioned in that passage? Just keep that parked in your mind for later. It's only through this following scene with the store clerk that we understand the man she's hiding from was Culla. And realizing this during my reread actually changed my perspective of Culla, because it means he actually was going in search of his sister rather than just looking for work as I originally thought. Even though he says many times that he has no goal or destination in mind, and he doesn't even ask people if they've seen Wrenthy. He's not really trying all that hard to find her, but apparently he's looking for her. But it's not like he tries that hard at anything he does, which is seen through the whole story. He's neglectful of Wrenthy even, and she's all that he has. Like when she's cold at night while she's pregnant, like very pregnant, she's about to pop, and asks if they can have a fire. He says, maybe. He won't go get the girl some cocoa, or a woman to help Wrenthy with the birth. He won't even clean the dirty window so she can look outside while she's confined to bed and healing. He's literally bored with nothing to do and whittling away at a stump of wood while Wrenthy is so exhausted after giving birth she's sleeping in the foul, bloody, gore-smeared bed she gave birth in. However, once Wrenthy finds out her child is alive, she never wavers from her path to find her son. While the siblings both begin this story in the same place of sin and ignorance, their paths take them on two very different journeys, even though we see them travel through the same towns and meet some of the same people and just narrowly miss each other. Wrenthy and her childlike sincerity and inherent goodness draws people to her, and Culla's thievery, lies, aimlessness, and irresponsible nature mark him as sinful. Wrenthy goes to a house to ask to stay and rest. We see her ignorance as she has no idea where town is or where she has walked from that day. There is a moment when a moth flutters by a lamp next to Wrenthy. They watched her sit, holding the bundle up before her, the lamp just at her elbow, belabored by a moth, whose dark shape cast upon her face appeared captive within the delicate skull, the thin and rose-lit bone, like something kept in a china mask. Lord, she said, I've not sat hardly today. Moths are a symbol of change and transformation. Wrenthy is evolving. She spends the night with this family, and the son has a sort of evil shiftlessness to him that reminded me of Culla. He's described as having cadaverous eyes, and he tries to lure Wrenthy, literally and figuratively, into the darkness, into sin, daring her to turn off her lamp while she was returning to the house in the night after washing up. He asks her if she's scared of the dark, but she doesn't fall for it. She's learned from her mistakes. She goes into the house and will not be distracted from her goal. The next day, the boy makes some dismissive remarks about his mother's quilt she's going to sell in town, which leads to a major theme in this novel: work. Both Culla and Wrenthy encounter the best situations at the beginning of their journeys. The first family she comes across is a true family where people care for one another. The boy cuts his knee, and the man is willing to use his bandana to bandage the boy's knee. But the wife knows he doesn't have any other bandana, so she gives up some of the muslin that she wrapped her quilt in. Fabric was an extremely expensive thing in the past, and muslin has many uses, one of them being the lining for quilts. So the woman sacrifices her fabric so the man will not have to go without his bandana. And one might think that this is looking too deep into these interactions. And maybe it is. But McCarthy shows us this interaction for a reason. The children of this family are soft in comparison to the crone, woman, and man. The two daughters don't quilt to help the mother, and the boy is at several times referred to as lazy. And we get hints that he is up to no good several times. And the man said during dinner that if he had the money, his family would never go without food, after Wrenthy comments that she had so rarely ever had light bread because she was raised hard. This family, while not having much, didn't raise their children hard. Is McCarthy saying that softness is what leads to indolence and perhaps even evil? Yeah, I think he might be. Is this perhaps why God is so hard on mankind? Maybe. The boy is lazy around the house, but he has money that his mother doesn't know about, which means he gets the money in shady ways, or that he is willing to work in secret so that he doesn't have to share or help his family. And that sounds a lot like Cullen. He's not a working man, but he has money his sister doesn't know about. But we don't know where his money came from. The boy is headed down the same path Cullen is, but Cullen would have been raised like Wrenthy. Hard. Unless, of course, their family fell on hard times when Wrenthy was a child, in which Cullen would have received a softer upbringing than she did. And yes, I realize none of that's in the story, but I think of characters like real people, so I try to make sense of things, okay? Sue me. Cullen and Wrenthy's parents are gone, and we don't know when they died, so potentially Wrenthy has received a harder upbringing than Cullen, because Cullen is older than Wrenthy is. So, facts. This theme of work is also demonstrated when Cullen meets the squire who he asks for a job. And through this encounter, we learn a lot about Cullen. The squire judges Cullen pretty harshly. So the squire says, "I won't ask you where you come by it. You married?" "No, I ain't married." He looked up at the squire. Their shadows canted upon the whitewashed brick of the kitchen shed, and a pantomime of static violence in which the squire reeled backward and he leaned upon him in headlong assault. "It ain't no crime to be poor," he said. "No, it ain't. It ain't a crime. I hope you've not got a family. It's a sacred thing, a family, a sacred obligation afore God." The squire had been looking away, and now he turned to home again. "It ain't no crime to be poor," he said. "That's right. But shiftlessness is a sin, I would judge. Wouldn't you?" "I reckon," he said. "Yes, the Bible reckons. What I got, I earned. They's not a man in this country'll tell you different. I've never known nothing but hard work. I've been many a time in the field at daybreak, waiting for the sun to come up to commence work. And I was there again when it went down. Daybreak to backbreak for a God-given dollar. There ain't a man in this country will dispute it." Holmes was looking down. One hand crossed over the back of the other, the way men stand in church. Now, this is a really interesting passage for several reasons. One of them being the squire saying how important and sacred the obligation of family is. He makes Cullen an offer to earn his supper by cutting down a blown-over tree with an axe. Cullen agrees to this without checking out the tree or asking any questions. He starts working, and he's making easy progress, but he feels it's taking too long. Probably because it's not like those old rotten tree stumps he's used to chopping up around the house he was staying at with Wrenthy. This shows us he's used to taking the easy road. So he goes and asks the squire for a saw, a shortcut. But there are no shortcuts. Anyone who's swung an axe for any period of time would not fault a person for wanting to make the job a bit easier. But I think this is a tool that McCarthy uses to show us Cullen's faults. Perhaps he wouldn't find the job so difficult if he had a reason to work hard. Like feed his family or son. The need to feed one's family can keep a person honest. When Cullen is finally done chopping up the tree, it's evening. He goes to square up with the squire, and the squire asks him why he didn't eat any dinner. Cullen says it wasn't offered. The squire then asks Cullen what time he started his day's work. Cullen's not sure. And it's at this point the reader realizes Cullen has no idea how the world of men or work conducts itself. And the squire knows it, and he's going to teach him a lesson about it. because it seems no one else has yet. The squire points out that Culla never negotiated his terms of service. He allowed the squire to set the wage, which was far too low for his labors, and Culla agreed to it. And one might see the squire in a poor light for taking advantage of Culla's ignorance. But the squire has worked for everything he has, and he shows mercy on Culla and his ignorance by giving him a $50 for his half day of work, which is fair, as we learn a day's worth is worth $1. The squire tells him to wash up before eating supper, gives him a place to stay in the barn, and more work and regular meals the next day. In the end, the squire is fair to Culla and is trying to teach him a lesson. But Culla leaves in the morning and steals the squire's new boots. There's this theme of work and fruitless labor, which is like a curse in the Bible for not walking in fellowship with God. We see Culla, a young man adrift with no purpose in his life, as he does not take on the responsibility of fatherhood. He takes from his sister the only thing of value to her in the house. He robbed her of her child. And it's no accident that we see how hard Wrenthy labored to bring their child into the world, or the lengths she's willing to go to get her son back, or how impossible her journey is considering she doesn't know the tinker by name or sight. And then Culla also steals from the squire who was fair to him and offers him work. He travels to another town where the bodies of the dead have been dug up and stripped of their clothes. Culla runs for his life and is pursued by townspeople, thinking he has robbed those graves. He gets to a farm where he finds work painting a roof. But on the second day, the townspeople find him and he must abandon the job without being paid. After he steals the boots, all of his labors are fruitless. He never gets any pay for his work, even when he's willing to work for just food and shelter after he is charged with trespassing. This is interesting. When we compare this to the early scene chopping wood, he will work off his sentence of 10 days' work at 50 cents a day. But he asks and practically begs to stay on longer. He doesn't care if he gets paid anymore. He's willing to work all day for board. But this squire, unlike the first, will not take him in. How the mighty have fallen. His situation worsens with every scene until just his mere presence brings doom to the swine and swineherder. The man Culla meets with the 8-foot snake hide said he used to make good money hunting ducks. He could kill up to 12 in one shot with a 4-gauge shotgun and get 50 cents apiece, way back in the day. And for those unaware, a 4-gauge shotgun is also known as a portable cannon. Just saying. This man was even offered $10 for the snake hide he's mounted. And for live snakes, he could get $1 a foot. And if he found one as big as the snake hide he had mounted, he'd get double, which would be $17. This man claims he would have been a rich man if he hadn't blown all his money on whiskey and ladies of the night. But this man's home, and by extension, him, is rotten. The back of the house is windowless, and there's a door with no handle. And behind the house is where the fresh water is. It feels as if this old man has turned his back to all that is good and clean. The man asks Culla to guess how deep this clean well is that he can get such sweet, good water out of. Culla guesses 50 feet, but it's not even 15 feet deep. Is this McCarthy implying that one doesn't need to dig very deep to find clean, life-giving water? Or perhaps human goodness? There's a small garden with loamy soil, which is ideal soil for most garden plants. But there is also a bunch of blue clay, and clay is the hardest earth to improve. It will drown anything you plant in it, even if you mix good soil in it and good slope for drainage. Don't ask me how I know. Let's just say a lot of good trees have died, okay? Anyways, could this be a metaphor for the old man? The loamy soil and fresh water could signify that the old man, and even Cullen, had everything he needed to thrive. He had a lucrative business, but instead he focused his view away from such assets and lost all his fortune on poor choices. And now he sits alone and lonely in his rotting house, practically begging Cullen to stay and keep him company. The way labor is monetized in this book really intrigues me. The first squire says a hard day's work is worth $1. The quilt, which depending on how intricate it is, would take weeks and maybe months to complete, and it's worth $3. We didn't find out what a day's worth of churning butter paid, but that woman's labor was for nothing as her husband stole it from her, just like Cullen stole Wrenthy's labor, her child. Those nice new boots Cullen stole would have cost several days of hard work, or so the beehiver man says to him. And that man asks if Cullen will trade shoes with him. So here's another person who wants something for nothing. But hunting or killing seems to make the most money so far and takes the least amount of time. It is easy work to kill. One shot of the old man's shotgun could bring him $6 for one moment. And this shows us that it is much harder to create than to destroy. And what's worse, destroying pays better. Something caught my attention, and that's the importance of boots. Now, humor me while I go off on a tangent, okay? Boots are expensive and hard to come by. And we see boots be coveted by several men in the story. A person's shoes says a lot about their situation. And we know that Cullen steals the new veal boots of the hard-working squire. So this is the scene after the squire gives Cullen the half-day's pay. And this is referring to Cullen. After he had washed, and he sat in the shade of the tool shed and pared idly at the sole of his shoe with the knife he carried. It doesn't say he's paring away mud from the sole of his shoe, but that he's paring the sole of his shoe. Why would anybody do that? That would ruin your shoes. And shoes are a very expensive thing to come by. But you know what does need paring? Hooves. Hooves need paring. Pigs' hooves do. Coincidence? I don't know. Now, there are a couple other times that I noted that Cullen would cut a stump or a door frame with his knife while he was idle also. So this may instead mean to demonstrate a man's destructive nature when he's not gainfully employed or working. But on with the boots. We later have this discussion about the different kinds of hooves pigs can have, and how that might distinguish which are clean and which are foul. This is certainly a comparison between the different kinds of humanity as well. There is a discussion about how if a hog didn't even have feet, he'd still be a hog, clean or unclean. It seems to not matter. A man is a man. Was Cullen, by stealing the respectable, hard-working squire's boots, trying to mask what he really was? Most people he met after he stole those boots saw him as suspicious and guilty. I think it was because those nice new boots didn't match the rest of his ragged appearance, which made those men think he robbed those graves. And before he enters the next town, he tries to clean himself up by washing up in a culvert, shaving and combing his hair. But he's ragged again by the time he reaches the town. Perhaps it's impossible to hide what you really are. And the boots illustrate the hierarchy of the unholy trinity as well. So Cullen, this is the first meeting with the three men. Home watched the fire in his unfocused vision. The coals beaded up in pins of light and drifted like hot spores. Blood had come up in his ears, and they were warm and half deaf with it. I don't care, he said. You will care, mister. I think maybe you are somebody else, because you don't seem to understand me very much. Now get them boots off. Harmon looked up and smiled. Holmes looked at the man. The fire had died some, and he could see him better, sitting beyond it, and the scene compressed into a kind of depthlessness. so that the black woods beyond them hung across his eyes oppressively, and the man seemed to be seated in the fire itself, cradling the flames to his body, as if there were something there beyond all warming. He reached and slid the boots from his feet, one, the other, and stood them before him. "Harmon," the man said. Harmon rose and came for the boots and took them to the man. The man seized them and examined them, bending closer to the fire, turning them in his hands like some barbaric cobbler inspecting the work of another world. He pulled off his own boots and put on those new ones and stood in them and took 3 steps up and 2 back and turned. Harmon had gathered up the old boots and was putting them on. The one with the rifle watched happily. "All right," the bearded one said. Holmes squatted in his naked feet beneath him. "Fix his," the man said. Harmon carried the boots he had discarded to the one with the rifle and stood before him. The one with the rifle looked at him, looked at them, and looked up at Harmon. Harmon took the rifle from him and kicked the empty boots. "Do 'em for him," the man said. Harmon knelt and pulled off the nameless one's boots and pushed the other boots at him. Then he rose with these boots and turned. The man gestured. Holmes watched, squatting, shoeless and half naked. Harmon came toward him, smiling, the rifle in one hand, and the last pair of boots in the other. He dropped them alongside Holmes and stood looking down at him. Holmes looked at the bearded one. "Them's is for you," the man said. Holmes looked at them. They were mismatched, cracked, shapeless, burnt-looking, and crudely mended everywhere with bits of wire and string. He looked at the nameless one, who sat likewise barefoot, with a pair of boots before him, relieved of the rifle. His hands lay on the ground on either side of him, and he was watching Holmes. Holmes looked away. "I said them ones there is yourn," the man said. Holmes looked at the boots again, then took one up, slowly, and pulled it onto his foot. A sour reek welled out of the top. "You don't have much to say, do you?" the man said. "No." "I guess you think maybe you and me should have traded." "I don't care," Holmes said. "I believe in taking care of my own," the man said. "That's the way I think." "Every man thinks his own way," Holmes said. The way that the man inspects the boots, like a cobbler from another world, or from the other ilk of man, perhaps. At this point, Cullen is very sorry to have lost his nice, stolen boots. Meanwhile, Wrenthy has been wandering around barefoot for most of the novel. And the man from the trio says, after he takes Cullen's boots and gives him a foul, tattered pair, "You may see the time you wish you had worse," the man said. And by the end of the novel, Cullen is wandering barefoot also. There is an exploration going on here about the different kinds of people who make up the world. These can be obviously seen in the conversation about the 2 different kinds of hogs in the herd. There are the mule-footed hogs and the cloved-foot hogs. The cloven-foot hogs are thought to be unclean and related to the devil because he is cloven-foot also. And the mule-footed hogs are considered other or potentially clean. They are both swine for certain, but there is a marked difference between them. But when the hogs are startled or possessed, it doesn't matter what kind of hog they are. They all run to their death and take the swineherder with them. And what's interesting is Wrenthy is also always looking out for varmints and trying to avoid them. And there is a point in that scene where she is traveling with the family that she asks if there are varmints in the area. And the woman tells her it's likely there are. And then when they stop to eat, the boy comes up from behind Wrenthy, and she is surprised by his presence, and he says he had been up in the woods. I feel as if this is a hint that he is a varmint, a pest. Now, we're going to go back to that point I made earlier about Wrenthy not using Cullen's name in that scene, where she sees him while she's hiding from him. Now, it seems as if the name Cullen is only ever said by Wrenthy. And after she leaves her brother, she never says his name again, unless it is to the storekeeper so that we know the unnamed man was Cullen. No other character ever says his first name. And Wrenthy, as far as I can see, is never called by her name either, except by Culla and the unnamed man she lives with later in the novel. He uses her name, but she never utters his. And the earlier mention of Culla being nameless in that earlier scene had me wondering if this was a hint to indicate that this was Culla also in the other scene. This person is someone she doesn't even want to speak to. And given Wrenthy's childlike friendly nature, this is unlike her. A moth had got in and floundered at the lamp chimney, with great-eyed wings, lay prostrate and quivering on the greasy oilcloth table cover. He crushed it with his fist and flicked it from his sight, and sat before the empty plate, drumming his fingers in the moth-shaped swatch of glinting dust it left. As I mentioned before, the moth is a symbol of transformation, inner wisdom, or hidden knowledge. And the moth is described as having great-eyed wings, and one can see the blindness constantly attributed to Culla in this novel. The man kills the moth with his fist, killing his symbolic discovery of his own inner wisdom and hidden knowledge by staying willfully blind. And this scene can be contrasted with the scene in which Wrenthy encounters the moth. So this shows Wrenthy's inner wisdom and transformation. She is learning. She is no longer willfully blind. She did not know she was leaving. She woke in the night and rose, half-tranced from the bed, and began to dress. In all darkness, with gravity. Perhaps some dream had moved her. She took her few things from the chifferboard and bundled them and went to the landing beyond her door. She listened for his breathing in the room opposite, but she could hear nothing. She crouched in the dark and longed for fear he was awake. And when she did descend the stairs in her bare feet, she paused again at the bottom, in the dead black foyer, and listened up the stairwell. And she waited again at the front door, with it open, poised between the maw of the dead and loveless house and the outer dark, like a frail thief. It was damp and cool, and she could hear roosters beginning. She closed the door and went down the path to the gate and into the road, shivering in the cold starlight, under Vega and the water serpent. She went west on the road while the sky grew pale and the waking world of shapes accrued about her. Hurrying along the sunrise at her back, she had the look of some deranged fugitive from its occurrence. Before she had gone far, she heard a horse on the road behind her, and she fled into the wood with her heart in her throat. It came out of the sun at a slow canter, in a silhouette agonized into shapelessness. She crouched in the bushes and watched it, a huge horse emerging, seared and whole from the sun's eye, and passing like a wrecked caravel, gaunt-ribbed and black and mad, with tattered saddle and dangling stirrups, and hoofs clomping softly in the dust, and passing enormous and emaciate and inflamed, and the sound of it dying down the road to a distant echo of applause in a hall forever empty. So Wrenthy leaves the dead and loveless house and goes into the outer dark under the star Vega and constellation of the water serpent, also known as Hydra. Now, Vega is a North Star and one of the brightest stars in the sky, and is used by the astronomical community to calibrate the brightness of everything else in the universe. Because of its stability, and that it doesn't flicker, Wrenthy chooses to enter the outer darkness, a biblical reference to the book of Matthew, where weeping and gnashing of teeth can be expected, and starts her new journey under this star, used as a guide for her journey. But our whole galaxy is headed toward Vega's general direction, perhaps symbolizing that this is everyone's journey. And the water serpent, or Hydra, constellation, is tied to Greek mythology and the second labor of Hercules. This is the second time Wrenthy goes out on her own, and Hercules had 12 labors in total, so that could possibly mean there's a long road ahead of her. And the god Apollo, said that if Hercules completed the 12 labors, he would be freed from the guilt of killing his own family. I mean, I don't like digging too deep into things, but that's quite a coincidence, isn't it? And then that horse came out of the sunrise like the sun god, Helios, and his horse-drawn chariot. But the rising sun also represents God in the Christian faith, and Yahweh was worshipped as the sun. So what does this mean? Does it mean that Wrenthy doesn't want to be saved? Is that why the halls of heaven are empty? Wrenthy is superstitious, as we see when she asks Kulla to put the axe back under her bed when she's in labor. The axe under the bed was thought to cut through a woman's birthing pains. Wrenthy listens to her intuition. She respects both pagan and Christian traditions, but she doesn't look to God to save her. Kulla, on the other hand, has that dream where he asks if he can be saved. And it's strange that he is there asking for salvation when he is surrounded by what's described as a delegation of human ruin. It seems outrageous that Kulla, someone physically whole, should be asking to be saved when the poor lot of people behind him are much worse. And maybe that was why the Reverend made such a quick call on him. There is a part in that scene where the Reverend talks about the grace of God. This blind feller hollered out one time and said, "Looky here at me, blind and all. I guess you reckon I art to love Jesus." "Well, neighbor," I says, "I believe you ort. He give you eyes to see, and then he tuck 'em away. And maybe you never was much of a Christian to start with, and he'd figured this'd bring you around. They's been more than one feller brought to the love of Jesus over the paths of affliction. And what better way than blind? In a world darksome as this'n, I believe a blind man ought to be better sighted than most. I believe it's got a good deal to recommend it. The grace of God don't rest easy on a man. It can blind him easy as not. It can bend him, and make him crooked. And just who did Jesus love, friends? The lame, and the halt, and the blind. That's who. Them's is the ones scarred with God's mercy, stricken with his love. Every legless fool and old blind mess like you is a flower in the garden of God. Amen." I told him that. Kulla is whole and has no reason that he should be begging for God's mercy. By the reasoning of this sermon, it also seems that those who are physically afflicted are favored by God. Now, my first thought was that the trio of men were a representation of the Furies. But then McCarthy uses the word consubstantial to describe them in the scene where they kill the old man with the shotgun. And you better believe I had to look up that word. No shame in it. Anytime you read a McCarthy novel, you need to keep Google handy. Consubstantial means of the same substance or essence, but used specifically of the three persons of the Trinity in Christian theology. Hold up. These guys are the unholy or profane Trinity. And their relationship to Kulla seems inevitable when we consider the nightmare he has at the beginning of the book, for his fate will be in the darkness. The Holy Trinity is about releasing humanity from suffering and evil, and this unholy Trinity would be the antithesis of that. They would be most concerned with ensuring humanity suffers and experiences evil. In the final scene with the baby is scarred, burned, and is missing an eye. This would be the example of God's love for the child if that sermon has any weight at all. God sent his son to be sacrificed for the sins of all, and Kulla sacrifices his son for his own sins. But if Jesus died for the sins of mankind, this baby's death feels more like the death of humanity's path to salvation. Kulla hands his child, his salvation, over once again at the end of the novel and has this conversation. This is with the trio, the unholy trio. "I figure you got this thing here in her belly of your own self and then laid it off on that tinker. I never laid nothing off on no tinker. I reckon you figured he'd keep him hid for you. I never figured nothing. What did you have to give him? I never give nobody nothing. I never had nothing. Never figured nothing. Never had nothing. Never was nothing, the man said. He was looking at nothing at all. The mute one seemed to sleep, crouched at the man's right with his arms dangling between his knees like something waiting to be wakened and fed. What are you? Home muttered. What? He said it again, sullenly. The bearded one smiled. Ah, he said. Now, we've heard that before, ain't we? You ain't nothing to me. But the man didn't seem to hear. He nodded, as if spoken by other voices. He didn't look at home. You never did say what you done with your sister. I never done nothing with her. Where's she at? I don't know. She run off. You done told that. It ain't nothing to do with you. I'll be the judge of that. Herman turned, his cheek against the upright rifle barrel. He smiled dreamily. I reckon little sister's just a little farther up the road, ain't she? The man said. I don't know. I ain't seen her. I allowed maybe you had, Holmes said. You seem to know everybody's business. I guess it ain't nothing to me. Is that right? So here we see Culla ask who he is and state that he is nothing to the man of the dark trio. And the man says that he will be the judge of that. Culla, in the previous scene with the trio, ate some meat, what seemed to be human meat. And given that the trio is a sort of unholy trinity, it seems Culla had a sort of first communion in that encounter. And a first communion is a very distinct day. It is the first time a person receives the Eucharist, which is symbolically the body and blood of Christ, the sacrifice. It's a display of the willingness of Catholics to connect with Christ. So this is Culla's communion with the Dark Trinity. There is something being said about the power of names here. Names have meaning. If one has no name, one cannot be claimed by anyone, by heaven or hell. So does that mean the baby can't go to hell? He belongs to no one? But it is also suggested that once a person who names a thing is dead, the name become nameless. This seems quite hopeless, as the namer will always eventually die. But where this could be overcome, perhaps, is with family. If one's parents die, one becomes nameless. But when one has children, one is given a new name of father and mother. One is claimed anew, again. Culla's salvation is denied him because he denied it of himself. And perhaps while not being a holy trinity, the family trinity would continue on, the Father, the Son, and Wrenthy, the family spirit. Most people see this story as very nihilistic, and I can't say that I blame them. But what I saw in this novel, and I'm not saying that this was McCarthy's intention, but perhaps is more about my own perceptions of life, is that death and tragedy is coming for us all. It doesn't matter which kind of human being you are, a useful or useless. But something I saw in the story of the first squire was that while we never found out his name while he was alive, we learned who he was after he died. Everyone called him Old Man Salter. And there was a general impact to the community that lost him. And perhaps we can also see that when he wants to know Culla's name, and that the man doesn't introduce himself either. There could be a few reasons for this, but I like to think of it as the squire knowing he isn't the center of the world. His family was. And then later we see those African American men digging Salter's grave, and we realize he is being placed next to Mrs. Salter. There is some traditional significance to the side in which couples are buried. The man is usually buried on the woman's right side, and the woman on the man's left side. This is how couples usually walk down the aisle when they are married, and so they are buried the same way. As in marriage, so in death. The wedding ring goes on the fourth finger of the left hand to signify that it is tied to the vein of love that goes directly to the heart. And so too the woman is on the man's left side in marriage and in death. Salter obviously has faced tragedy as he lost his wife, but she is waiting for him in death. He was not alone, as Culla is. Because of him, Wrenthy is also alone. I think the point of the story is to acknowledge that tragedy and death are coming for us all no matter what we do. But if one wants company and purpose on that tragic journey, don't add to it with your own blindness and inaction. This is a story of 3 different journeys taken. And this is not a Fellowship of the Rings kind of journey. Oh, heck no. It's a solitary, grim journey into a world of darkness and tragedy. It's like the Odyssey, but, without all the heroism and homecoming. So, without all the nice parts. Now, go to your local dog park and pet a dog. I think we could all use the endorphins right now. Thanks, McCarthy. But what did you think? Did you like this book? Did you hate it? Did you interpret differently than me? Please let us all know in the comments, as the McCarthy struggle bus continues for us all. But maybe if we all put our heads together, we can try to understand it together. So leave a comment. Please like and subscribe so that more people can join in the discussion in the comments and find some great books. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.